need to ask ourselves what the word tekton means, and particularly what it meant in first century Judea. One of the difficulties that we have in reading the Bible is, of course, it's in English, whereas obviously it was written down in Koine Greek. But the difficulty actually is not that, but it's much more than that, is that the use of Greek in the New Testament is not Greek. And I'm well familiar with the differences in language being married to an American and going to America and being misunderstood in America and misunderstanding Americans, because I think might have been Oscar Wilde that said we're divided by a common language or something. That I minister quite a lot in Spain. I just came back from doing an Easter conference in Spain about the Jewish Jesus, and I was reminded of the difference between Castilian Spanish and the Spanish that they speak in Venezuela. And they're quite different if you're knowledgeable about Spanish. They obviously they're the same language, but they're actually very different in somewhat the same way that North American English differs distinctly from English. And so the guys who were writing the New Testament were Judean Jews, and they were using that language, the lingua franca of their day, in the way that Judean Jews used Greek, and not the way later Greek authors used Greek, which is a problem if you're using Greek lexicons to translate the New Testament, because they're going to give you the Greek meanings of the Greek words. They won't necessarily give you the Judean meanings or use of the Greek words. And the word tekton occurs 3 times in the New Testament. Fortunately, one of them gives us a context, but the 2 that get quoted the most are from the Gospels. And the first is in Matthew 13 and verse 55, where the crowd in Nazareth are trying to reconcile this bearded scholar with a group of disciples who's teaching in their synagogue with their memory of this prepubescent boy who had left to go and do further Talmudic and Mishnaic studies in Jerusalem. They ask, isn't this the Tekton's son? There's a little bit of recognition going on. His sisters are with us, but he hasn't been. And there's no context there for the use of the word. And it's the same in the parallel passage in Mark 6, where they say, isn't this the carpenter, or the Tekton, rather than Joseph's son? It's the Tekton, the son of Mary, brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon. His sisters are with us. But there's no context. When you're translating, and my wife's an interpreter, there's a saying that translators have, that context is king. So when you're translating and you have a choice of words, it's the context that tells you the correct translation for the word, that if you've got a choice, the one that you should choose. Context is king. So in Mark's use, in Mark 6:3, again, there is no context. In fact, it's the exact same event that's being described, just Jesus returned to Nazareth. But there is, fortunately, a context in the New Testament. Does anyone know where it is? Because if you won't find it under tekton, you'll find it under the compound word archaitekton. So you find it in 1 Corinthians 3, verse 10. This is the 3rd use of the word tekton in the New Testament, and fortunately for us, Paul gives us a context. And this extremely important context, particularly when you remember that Paul was someone who worked with cloth and needle and thread, traditionally believed to have been a tent maker. Some people have other ideas about that, but he certainly wasn't a tekton. And yet in 1 Corinthians 3, verse 10, we see Paul describing himself as a tekton, and not any old tekton. It's a wise tekton, and not only old wise tekton, it's a wise master tekton. And the Greek word there is archaitekton. It's one word, which every translation in English that I've come across, and that's quite a few, split in half. There's no reason to break archaitekton in half when you're translating it. And I don't think that you need to have a degree in Greek to know what archaitekton means. It means architect. But the translators always break it into its component halves. Archai, which means master, or chief, or first of, and tekton, which means whatever tekton means. And in your Bibles, and in all the English Bibles, tekton is always translated there as builder. It's never translated as carpenter, because carpenter doesn't fit the context that Paul is giving. And the context is laying a foundation and then building upon it. So Tektons laid foundations and built on them. Master builder, architecton, or architect. And the other interesting thing about that verse is this other person who's building on the foundation. So Paul describes himself as sophos architecton, wise architect. And in building the church in Corinth, Paul was laying a foundation. And he says that another is building on it. Another wise architect. Who do you think he might have meant? I think he meant the Tekton, who said, on this rock, the bedrock, the Petra, I'll build my church, and the gates of hell will not overpower it. That Tekton was building on the foundation that Paul was laying and had laid in Corinth, because that Tekton built the church, not us. But the illustration is a big building illustration. And of course, big buildings need foundations. The vast majority of buildings in first century Judea were not big buildings. They were single-story structures, some of which had a bit put on top. They were built on rock, and they didn't require foundations. They were single-story buildings. Larger buildings, certainly in excess of 2 stories, required and still require foundations. And there were 3 types of big building in first century Judea. There were palaces, there were temples, and there were towers. And we're going to look first of all at temples. And we'll look at the description of one temple in particular, the temple that Herod built, Herod the Great, commonly referred to as the Second Temple, although it was the third sort of construction phase after Solomon's first temple. And if we read the contemporaneous Jewish Roman historian Josephus and his book, The Antiquities, we'll find a very interesting description of how Herod went about building the temple. So in book 15 of Antiquities, we read, in 18 BC, and that's my date, by the way, but that's the actual date, King Herod undertook a very great work to build of himself the temple of God. I love Josephus' humour there. It's a little dig at Herod. All right, King Herod built it of himself. The temple was Herod's psyche expressed in building form. It was supposed to be for God, but actually it was for Rome and it was for Herod's own ego. And Josephus gives a little dig at Herod there. But he tells us he undertook a very great work to build the temple of God and make it larger in compass, because the one that had been built by the exiles on their return did not match the dimensions given in the law. And raise it, Josephus says, to a most magnificent altitude. And he did. And there it is. It was one of the wonders of the ancient world. It was covered in gold, in part. It was made of marble. And it was said to appear like a mountain covered in gold. It was one of the most beautiful buildings the world ever saw. And there was a saying in Rome that you haven't seen a building if you haven't seen the temple of Herod the Great. That's how great it was. It was a phenomenal building. It was the prescribed height of 165 feet tall. And remember that these guys were building without the benefit of cranes. They were building without the benefit of any sort of hydraulic lifting equipment. No diggers. But that's not all. It was built, we'll look at this in a moment, it was built on an artificial plateau created at the top of Mount Moriah. It wasn't built on rock. In most part, the site wasn't built on rock. It was built on a greatly expanded platform at the top of Mount Moriah. But to build the temple, Herod had a problem. The problem was that the temple was a functioning temple. It was an existing temple. It was in use every day. And the only way that you could change anything or build anything in that site of the court of the priests was to use priests, because the functioning temple was effectively a holy building site. And the court of the priests, which was where the largest part of the work was going on, the temple, a holy place with the Holy of Holies inside, was off limits to everybody except priests. And so Herod did the only thing he could do. He recruited priests. It's a bit like having to rebuild St. Paul's Cathedral when you're limited to Anglican vicars. And that's no disrespect to any Anglican vicar who might be here. But you imagine taking your typical Anglican vicar and asking them to rebuild St. Paul's Cathedral, put the dome on, and that would be quite an undertaking. But that's the sort of logistical problem that Herod had, because it was a functioning temple and only priests could go in that part of the site. And so Josephus records what Herod did, which was the only thing he could do, which was in addition to 10,000 of the most skillful workmen, that Herod recruited 1,000 priests, 1,000 sacerdotal priestly garments for as many of the priests, and had some of them taught the art of stone cutting and others of the Tekton. Again, it gets translated incorrectly as Carpenter by that particular translation of Josephus, but they were Tektons. So the Tektons were necessary in the building of Herod's temple, because it was such a big building. The foundations of Herod's temple went down in excess of 200 feet. I'm not a builder, but 200 feet deep foundations are deep footings. That exists today. Many of you will have seen that. Some of you may have been there. The Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. You can see the height of the wall in relation to the worshippers at the base. That gives you an idea of the existing height that we have today. It's the only surviving remnant of this structure that Herod the Great built. That is an archaeologist's drawing of what the Wailing Wall would have resembled in the existing structure. In other words, the bit below the red outline is below the ground, and the bit above the red outline was demolished by the Roman army under Vespasian and Titus in AD 70. All of that side was razed in AD 70, with the exception of the Wailing Wall. But that's what it looked like before. Would you say that that was a job for an architect? I think it is. That's what the site looked at. Herod wanted a big site. He had huge numbers of pilgrims coming to Jerusalem, and he wanted to accommodate them because he liked to put himself across as being Jewish, although his mother was an Arab from Petra in Jordan. And his father was an Idumean who converted to Judaism under the reign of the Maccabees. So what Herod did is he built a retaining wall around Mount Moriah, a huge hundreds and hundreds of feet wall, and he infilled it with earth, creating an expanded platform of 144,000 square meters. Sorry, it's square feet, beg your pardon. 144,000 square feet, a huge platform upon which he built the buildings and walls of the temple, which were elevated above Jerusalem, rather like a giant wedding cake. And that expanded platform, because it was infilling of earth, required enormous foundation depths to get down to the rock below the infilled earth. So if you can imagine, it was basically a large infilled area upon which the temple was built, which tells us why the foundations had to be so deep. So hence Paul's remark about a tekton building on the foundation. It had to be built by priests. Who could, do you think, and who would be needed, do you think, to train 1,000 separatist, devout Jewish priests as builders? What sort of person would you need to train separatist, religious Jews, elite Jews, the priests, as tektons, in order that they might build this huge building, which took 6 years to build, although the surrounding courts were still being built at the time of Jesus? Thank you. You'd need to have a Jewish, Judean architect who was keeping the law to the satisfaction of the Jewish priests, and therefore whom would be acceptable to them as a trainer. Psychologically, you'd have to have someone that they respected, And they didn't respect ordinary Jews, who they regarded as sinners, but they did respect the scholars who kept the law. Scholars who knew the law better than they, the priests, did. Because while the priests knew the law, they didn't know it to quite the same depth as the scholars, the really devout teachers who taught Torah. You'd have to be dikaios, according to the law, and you'd have to be a Tekton, you'd have to be from Judea, and you'd have to be there in 18 BC. Someone who kept their religious law. Joseph lived at that time, and as a devout Tekton, was ideal for training the elitist priests. There is actually one other devout Jewish Tekton known from that region at that time. It's Rabbi Shammai, whose teaching on divorce is referred to indirectly by Jesus in the Gospel. So he's he's asked to choose between two teachings on divorce, a strict one and a lax one. Shammai was the strict of the two, and Shammai was a Tekton. He was a rabbi who was a Tekton. All rabbis had second jobs, and Rabbi Shammai's was a Tekton. The only other Tekton who was devout from that time period was Joseph, the husband of Mary, to whom was born Messiah. That's a picture from Robinson's Tunnel, which you can go and see today in Jerusalem. You've got stones there that weigh in excess of 200 tons. They have beveled edges to make them fit together, and they are the size of goods trains' carriages. They are massive, and they were in the foundation of the temple of Herod. So you begin to get an idea of the magnitude of the illustration when Jesus refers to himself as the cornerstone, the foundation stone. So the question then is, why do we meet Joseph in Nazareth? If he's from Judea, he has to return there for the census that Augustus arranged. What's he doing in Nazareth? He's from Judea. He's in Nazareth, and this isn't original to me, because of its proximity to Sepphoris. Sepphoris was the Roman capital of Galilee, and it was a place where huge Roman fortifications were occurring. And if you had a job for an architect, and you were Herod or Herod's son, Antipas, who might you consider to be a good candidate for those works in Sepphoris? Perhaps you would use your existing architect after the temple main structure was finished in 12 BC. And there's the excavations that are being dug today at Sepphoris. There were huge Roman fortifications and buildings going on there, and there would be a need for a specialist to come and oversee that work. If Joseph was a carpenter, there would have been absolutely no need for him to have gone to Nazareth, because Nazareth had plenty of carpenters of its own. The fact that he's travelling and working somewhere distant from his hometown indicates that he had specialist skills, and Tektons were specialist builders. Josephus mentions Sepphoris in Antiquities 18 in relation to Antipas, who furthered his father Herod the Great's work in building a large wall, fortified wall, around Sepphoris, which Josephus says was the security of all Galilee, making it the metropolis of the country. Which architect would Antipas have used? Quite possibly his father's architect. Josephus says in Wars of the Jews, Book 3, the danger of losing Sepphoris would be no small one in this war, the Roman-Jewish war, which was now beginning, seeing it was the largest city of Galilee and built in the place by nature very strong. It might be security for the whole nation. A big building, big town, needs an architect. Jesus went to the temple when he was lost, age 12, I believe, because he was known there. He was known there as the architect's son, and the priests who lived and worked in the temple had accommodation in the temple court. They weren't childminders. They know Jesus' Father, and Jesus refers to him in the saying that we referred to earlier about the Father's house. And Jesus refers to this again in Matthew 12:6 and the Proverbs in Hebrews 3, which says that one greater than the temple is here, because the builder of the house, or the firstborn son in that culture of the builder, had more honour or was greater than the house. So that's temples, but Tekton's also built towers. If you've ever read this rhetorical question that Jesus asked in Luke 14, I wonder whether you've ever asked another question, which is, which of Jesus' audience on that day would have been in the market for building a tower? So Jesus asked the question to the crowd, ordinary Jewish followers, which of you, intending to build a tower, does not sit down first and count the cost, whether he has sufficient to finish it? Because if he starts and can't finish, he will be a laughingstock. But how many of Jesus' audience that day would have been intending to build a tower? Who built towers? Towers were built by kings and by groups of city elders from a large enough city and with enough money to fortify their city with a tower. They were extremely difficult to build and extremely expensive to build. And I don't think anybody in the ordinary Jewish public sitting, listening to Jesus on that day, would have wanted to build a tower. Quite different if he'd said, which of you wanting to build a single-storey house? Or which of you wanting to make a table or a chair, if he'd been a carpenter? But he doesn't. He asks which of them wanting to build a tower. That saying only makes sense if the speaker is a tower builder. And there's another tower that Jesus refers to in Luke 13, when he tells the crowd, do you suppose that those 18 on whom the tower in Siloam fell and killed them were worse culprits than all the men who lived in Jerusalem? Why is Jesus referring to a tower? It's because the Tektons built towers. Well, I don't think this one was built by Joseph. There was a foundation problem. The tower fell over and killed 18 Jews. So where in the Gospels are the small woodwork or carpentry illustrations? Actually, there aren't any, because the only one that might possibly be is actually a Tekton illustration, and that is in Luke 6:41, where Jesus asks a rhetorical question, why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? And the word log there is dokos, which is the word for a roof beam. And the roof beams in Herod's temple were 100 feet in length. Jesus is using a teaching device called hyperbole. It's one the rabbis love to use, where you take a very little thing and you compare it, humorously often, with a very, very big thing. So he does it in the illustration of sieving out a gnat, but swallowing a camel. Tiny little thing, huge thing. There was a type of gnat that laid its eggs in wine vinegar. And the Jews would use Muslim gauze to sieve their wine. So they didn't want to swallow gnats. And imagine swallowing a camel. You know, one hoof's down, you got that far. Can you get the next hoof down? It's a very humorous illustration. It's supposed to be funny. And the word in this passage that Jesus uses to compare with a tiny little speck or sliver of sawdust, which you would get when you were planing wood to make roof beams, is compared with a dokos, a huge beam or log. Very big illustration, and a great example of hyperbole. A plank really doesn't work because it isn't quite a large enough discrepancy in size. So rabbinic hyperbole involved two things of hugely different size, and dokos is roof beam. But Tektons built the other temple buildings too, not just the holy place. And there's an interesting example of what I think of as distraction technique employed by the disciples immediately after a certain row that Jesus had with other rabbinic scholars. It's in Matthew 24, verse 1, where we read, Jesus came out from the temple. At this point, he's just had this row with the Pharisees and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. Why might they have been wanting to point out these buildings? Mark tells us that one of his disciples said, "Teacher, didaskalos, behold, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." What's happened just before? We have the 8 woes of Matthew 23. Jesus is very, very angry with the religious leaders of his day, who he says had the key of Torah, but rather than unlocking it and going in, they'd locked it with themselves on the outside and were keeping everybody else out as well. He was absolutely furious with them, and you have these 8 woes, which in the Greek is seriously strong language. I won't say unrepeatable, but it's very, very strong language. So, for example, in Matthew 23:33, and remember, he's a senior teacher speaking to other senior teachers and calling them snakes and vipers. Really insulting terminology. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell? He's worked up righteous indignation with these religious men who are keeping ordinary people out of the kingdom. And he leaves there, and the disciples don't know what to do. They're really embarrassed by this row that their masters had with these senior Jews. They are seriously embarrassed, and they do their best to calm Jesus down. That's what's happening. They're trying to distract Jesus away from his row with the Pharisees to his own area of special interest, which was the temple buildings. It's distraction technique, and it failed miserably. Jesus wasn't in the mood to be distracted. So we see him saying, "You see these buildings? These buildings that Tekton's built, not one stone will be left on another." But they wish they hadn't asked. More Tekton teachings. So in Luke 6, this is a very well-known one, the house on the rock. "Everyone who comes to me and hears my words and acts on them, I'll show you whom he's like. He's like a man building a house, not making a table or chair, but building a house, who dug deep and laid a foundation on the rock." The exact use of Tekton that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 3. "And when a flood occurred, the torrent burst against that house and could not shake it because it had been well built. But the one who has heard and not acted accordingly is like a man who builds a house on ground without any foundation. And the torrent burst against it, and immediately it collapsed. And the ruin of that house was great." And in Matthew's account, there's an interesting word used for ground. It's amos. And it gets translated often as sand. And you've probably seen the children's books that talk about the wise and foolish man and the foolish man who built his house on sand. You maybe even sung that song. Certainly used to sing it. It's not sand, actually. It's sandy soil. Nobody would be silly enough to build on the beach. In fact, perhaps they would. There's one example. But beaches are not good places to build. And the Jews knew that, and they didn't build on them. They didn't have beaches, but they certainly didn't build on them. Amos means sandy ground or sandy soil. It's soil with a high content of sand. It's a technical term for ground that might look okay, but has a sufficiently high proportion of sand in it to make it dangerous to build on without a proper foundation. So you'd have to take a soil sample and examine it and see what proportion of that ground was solid and what proportion was sand, because when water comes, the sand will shift. And if you haven't got a deep enough foundation, your house will collapse, as we saw actually in the recent storms in England last year. To build on sandy soil is fine if you go down far enough to find rock and you put a footing in and a platform. Much better to build on rock, much more secure. Single stories buildings were easy to build. As long as you had a rock base to build on, a rock platform, you didn't need a foundation. You could build directly on rock. But if you had sandy ground, you needed a foundation. What about Jesus' other temple building claims? Early in his public ministry, we find Jesus saying to the Jews this very controversial statement that reappeared at his trial. They took note of this saying of Jesus and they brought it back to him before the Sanhedrin. So in John 2, 19 and 20, Jesus answers and says, "Destroy this temple," and he's at the temple, "and in 3 days I'll raise it up." The Jews said it took 46 years to build this temple. And by the way, it was still going on in terms of the works on the outer courts. It took them 46 years to that day to build what they'd built so far, which is nearly finished, but not quite. And will you, Jesus, raise it up in 3 days? Do you see what's missing in that statement? Sometimes what's missing in the scripture is as important as what's there. What's missing is any question from Jesus' enemies about his ability to build. They take no issue whatsoever with Jesus' status or standing as a Tekton and his ability to build a temple. They don't say to him, "You couldn't possibly, you're a carpenter. How do you mean you could build it?" They only question the time period concerned. And of course, Jesus was talking about the temple of his body, but they take him to mean the literal temple of Herod. But they don't query his ability as a Tekton. And Tekton teachings continue throughout the New Testament because Jesus' disciples were replaying his teaching in their teaching. And if you see Jesus as a rabbinic scholar who's had a ministry in the court of Israel with the doctors of Torah prior to his public ministry commencing, you can see that there is not necessarily any discrepancy between his teaching and Paul's teaching. Some people talk about Paul's gospel as if it was somehow different from Jesus. But Paul was a disciple of Jesus. At very least, he's rubbed shoulders with Jesus during Jesus' 3.5-year public ministry when Jesus was teaching in the temple, because Paul was in the temple too, and Jesus was very well known. Paul and the other apostles take Jesus' teaching into their writings, and we see an example of this in Ephesians 2, verses 20 and 21, where Paul talks about building the church on the foundation of apostles and prophets, with Jesus himself being the cornerstone, the biggest stone, weighing about 400 tons, in whom the whole building fitted together is growing into a holy temple in the Lord. It's a temple building illustration. And it's one that Peter echoes in 1 Peter 2, verse 5. You also, like living stones, being built into a spiritual house, read temple, to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. It's a temple building illustration, and it's applied to the building of the church that the apostles saw themselves as doing. And finally, in 1 Peter 2, verse 7, the stone the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. Who built the temple? Priests. Who rejected Jesus? The priests. It's just the same in Stephen's speech to the Sanhedrin in the book of Acts, Acts 4:11. This is the stone that was set at naught by you, the builders. Stephen is standing before the Sanhedrin, who are about to condemn him to death. And he speaks of Jesus as the stone which they, the builders, rejected. He's standing before the very men who had been trained to be builders by Jesus' family. Getting nearer the end, let's go back into the Old Testament and think about God the architect. Of course, God laid the foundations of the earth. Those are pretty big foundations. Do you agree? The universe, that's sort of quite large compared to most foundations that get laid nowadays. There was a time when God the Father marked out the foundations of the earth. And we're told about it in Proverbs 8 and verses 29 to 31. And in that passage, wisdom appears, proverbially appearing in a personified form, which Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians as being a type of Jesus. So he speaks of Christ, the wisdom of God. And in Proverbs 8, we find wisdom, read Jesus, the Son, appearing beside the Father at the laying of the foundations of the earth and the universe in general. And this is a parallel passage in the Old Testament to 1 Corinthians 3, verse 10. God the Father is marking out the foundations of the earth. Who had marked out the foundations of the temple? Joseph the Father, or the Tekton. Who was besides God the Father as a master workman when God the Father laid the foundations of the earth? Jesus the Son of God. Daily Father's delight, rejoicing before him. In the world his earth, and my delight in the sons of men. What do you think the Hebrew word for workman also means? It's amon. It means architect. Surprise, surprise. Master craftsman or architect. So God the architect, his son, Jesus the architect, the master workman, the master in Greek, Tekton, the architecton, the architect. So we see God the Father and God the Son at the creation of the world being paralleled in the construction of the temple by Joseph the Father and Jesus the Son. Because when Jesus went to rabbinic university, like all Jewish scholars, he had to have a day job. You couldn't simply exist on Torah teaching. You weren't allowed to. So all teachers and students had a day job, and Jesus was a tekton at a time when the temple works, not the main works, but the subsidiary works, were still going on. So he was known as the architect's son in just the same way that he had been the Father's son at the creation of the world. Drawing to a close. Why does it matter? Why is this important? It's important, as I spoke earlier, because we have the opposite perspective of those people we read in the Gospels. They knew exactly who Jesus was as a man, but they didn't know then, most of them, that he was God. Today it's the opposite. Most of us know that Jesus is God and was God. We may have lost sight of his humanity at the distance of 2,000 years. It's important because many people today who are outside of God's kingdom have been told to place the Bible in the category of mythology. They treat Scripture as if it was myth. I know this because I do street evangelism every Saturday, apart from when I'm somewhere else. And I know that people think of the Scripture as mythology. You know, it's, oh, it's a myth, you can't believe that. Or it's legend. They're asked by Christians who are evangelizing them to make a huge leap of faith, actually, to put their trust in someone in whom they don't believe. They don't believe in God. How can they put their trust in somebody whom they don't believe in? In someone who some theologians say is playing the God card every time he does something extraordinary like clear the temple. We're asking them to believe in the Jesus who many theologians say was actually playing the God card in doing things that an ordinary Jew couldn't have done. And well, we know he was an ordinary Jew, therefore he couldn't have done that, therefore he was playing the God card, therefore we're asking you to believe in this person who's playing the God card, but unfortunately you don't believe in God. It's a difficult position. If we can link Jesus and his family to established Roman history, it makes believing in the historic Jesus more credible and easier for non-Christians. And one of the great blessings that I've had is when I've heard of people who become Christians through reading the Jesus Discovery, who weren't Christians before because they thought it was myth and somehow disconnected from reality. For example, in the cleansing of the temple. Anyone who knows about the temple and about the Jewish structure and the Roman oversight knows that that event is impossible for an ordinary Jew to do. And yet we're somehow asking people who don't believe in God to believe that this man was playing the God card in doing that. when he wasn't. He was just exercising the authority he had in that society as a senior Jewish scholar. The link to established Roman history helps people who don't believe the Bible to take a step nearer to the Bible. It's like a stepping stone nearer to the Jesus of the Bible. It's a very helpful way for people to connect with Scripture, because you're asking them to believe something that a Roman historian said and not a biblical writer. It gives us the same perspective, I believe, on Jesus' humanity that his contemporaries had, and makes more sense of the text.